I'm glad to welcome Benjamin Kerstein to the podcast once again. The last time he was on the show, we discussed the bizarre but fantastic novel by J.G. Ballard, Crash, which he contributed an essay on Quillette about. Now we're paying tribute to David Lynch. Ben uh, published a wonderful essay in tribute to Lynch titled American Surrealists. So let's begin. Hello, Ben. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Keeping it busy. Uh,
Yeah, me too.
2025's been off to a hectic start.
For all of us, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was taken aback, honestly, by the passing of David Lynch because I think he was what 70 or something when he passed away,
Yeah, it's
and
quite young.
a part of me just thought that he would never die because he's earned a kind of quasi-mythical status in my imagination, the same way as with people like David Bowie or Prince.
Mm.
Yeah. So, how did you hear about his passing?
I saw it actually on Substack, where I'm very active these days. Um, and I actually had the opposite reaction. I was not surprised because I knew that he was a chain smoker
Yeah.
from the age of about 13 or something like that. And as a former chain smoker myself, I can tell you that it does a number on you over time, and I thankfully have quit. Um, but I was not shocked, and I also knew he was ill, that he had emphysema. But I was very, very saddened by it, and I felt, there's not going to be any more David Lynch films or television series, and that's just terribly sad, I think. Particularly if you look at the state of American cinema today, the need for a voice as original and as compelling as his is greater than ever. And I was just very, very, I just felt it was very sad.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. He came at a time when American cinema was finding its original voice again, right? It was during the 70s, and some of my favorite filmmakers were in Hollywood in the 70s, like Coppola and Scorsese. But yeah, Lynch, I was introduced to Lynch by Eraserhead. He released that movie
Mhm.
in 77 and just blew my mind out of the water. I didn't know that people can make movies like that.
Extraordinary film, absolutely extraordinary. And I used that in my article. I explored in detail two of his works, which was Eraserhead and then a web series that he did about 20 years ago called Rabbits, which I
Mhm.
think is just an extraordinary piece of black comedy slash horror. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen. But actually, I rewatched Eraserhead after he died. And what struck me above everything else, and I've seen it in the theater, and it is really powerful on the big screen, particularly the final montage. I'll try not to give away anything, but it's just this orgy of surrealism, and it's really an amazing sequence on the big screen. Um, but what amazes me still about Eraserhead is that it was made for basically no money. Um, uh, with none of the resources that a major studio or even an independent studio like A24 could have given it. And yet it is one of the most beautifully wrought films that you will ever see. The photography is as good as any classic Hollywood black and white film. And I really think that it's important to emphasize that Lynch was a prodigy. That in his very first movie, you see everything that he's going to do for the rest of his career. And I don't actually think it's his best film, or I think that his masterpiece is Twin Peaks, all three seasons. To my mind, that's my personal favorite. Um, But to me, the film that springs to my mind when I see it is Citizen Kane, because when you see Citizen Kane, you see everything that Orson Welles is going to do for the rest of his career, in full. And I think that that makes Eraserhead really one of the most extraordinary debut films of all time. And of course, there's The Baby, which is one of the greatest practical special effects ever created. It's as good as anything Stan Winston Studios created for James Cameron, or Jim Henson created for George Lucas. It is really, really extraordinary. And to see it in a no budget independent film articulated by Lynch himself, and he never revealed how he'd done it. He was always very coy about The
Mhm.
Baby. Is really tells you everything you need to know about the extent of the man's talent. He was really absolutely one of a kind. And that to me is the most extraordinary thing about him, which is that he became a pretty big mainstream success, particularly with Twin Peaks. And yet he did so without ever sacrificing his very, very strange and idiosyncratic style. And that's a feat that very, very few other filmmakers have accomplished. Stanley Kubrick springs to mind immediately, Martin Scorsese, but very, very few others have managed to do that. It's quite an extraordinary legacy, I think.
Mhm. Yes. Of course, I'm not surprised at the state of originality or lack thereof in, mainstream Hollywood cinema today. I mean, the Oscars just came out, and the list of nominees are just as predictable as the last year and the year before it.
Mhm.
But what does surprise me is that someone who is as original and as daring as David Lynch could become so popular. And at
Mhm.
his death, there are tributes from everywhere in mainstream Hollywood.
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
can how could this be achieved?
It's in a certain sense inexplicable. I'm not sure there's an explanation, a logical explanation for it. Some of these people are just sui generis. I mean, there's no real explaining it. Again, Stanley Kubrick is an excellent example. Like there just was never anyone like him before, and there'll never be anyone like him again. But I think part of it is that Lynch's great talent was to combine this very strange, surrealist content with a level of technique that is incredibly classical and really goes back to the golden age of Hollywood. So you have, on the one hand, this very strange, disturbing stuff going on, but the visual aesthetic, the technical virtuosity at work both anchors the weirdness and gives you a way into the film. And I think that combination is really unique. It's hard for me to think of another filmmaker who accomplished that. And so I think people were drawn to his originality because it was different. And people do like to see something different. I mean, people don't always want to go to Marvel movies. Um, and yet it was done in a way that engaged them completely and did not alienate them through its weirdness. And it drew them in through its beauty and then sort of shocked them with the oddness and in many ways the disturbing nature of what's going on. I mean, Lynch's world is a very dark one in some ways. But the other thing is his films are very, very, the only word I can use is erotic. They're very sensuous. And once you're kind of in there for long enough, you don't really want to leave. As horrifying as some of the content can be, you want to stay there in that world because there's such beauty and sensuality in it. And I think that that really did draw people in and keep them there. And also, to an extent, Lynch did become a brand, like the weirdest man in America, capital letters. And he became kind of a lovable eccentric, I think, to a lot of people in pop culture. Um, and then the other more practical reason is just Twin Peaks. The impact of that series was so enormous when it initially came out, And it was such an anticipation and a precursor to what we now think of as prestige television. In other words, I don't think that we would have had The Sopranos, for example, without Twin Peaks. I don't think we would have had, definitely wouldn't have had True Detective without Twin Peaks. I mean, you know, in some ways, True Detective is basically a homage to Twin Peaks in a lot of ways. So it changed television forever, and also it's hard to convey. And I was a teenager when that came out, and I remember the frenzy around Twin Peaks. I mean, people were just obsessed with the show, and that question, who killed Laura Palmer, was just everywhere. It was the biggest mystery in TV since, who shot JR, took over that show, Dallas. Um, and I think that forever just etched Lynch into the sort of pop culture of the United States. So I think it's a combination of all those things together.
Yes. Yes, Twin Peaks is a television marvel. And
Mm.
I remember fondly during my college years, like watching it all the way through, even through the return season. I think that in itself is one of the greatest movie, if you
Yeah,
can say it, that Lynch ever did. And it
extraordinary.
was this like last achievement. But since you mentioned the rabbits, I guess
Mm.
pseudo sitcom,
Yes.
how does David Lynch pay homage to the television that he grew up with?
Well, I think that he's both parodying it and, in a strange way, sending a love letter to it. Um, on the one hand, he illustrates just how insane sitcoms are. The fact that whenever one of the rabbits enters a room, there's wild applause for no reason whatsoever. The laugh track makes no sense. People, it goes off on these totally bizarre non sequiturs that the rabbits are saying. Um, but on the other hand, he's giving a picture of human empathy in the face of this very scary outside world. And I think particularly the final moment of the last episode I found incredibly moving, where the rabbits sort of embrace on the couch, and one of them says, "I wonder who I will be," as the lights fade out. And I thought it was this beautiful moment of human empathy um, in the face of this very frightening world outside. And I think that what Lynch was conveying there is A, sitcoms are absurd. They're crazy. Like you watch them and you hear people laughing when there's no one there to laugh. I mean, just the fact of a laugh track, if you really think about it, is absolutely bizarre. You're basically having an audience laughing when there's no audience there. Um, and Orson Welles once said something very funny where he said, those laugh tracks were recorded decades ago. So a lot of those people laughing are dead. So you're hearing essentially people laughing from beyond the grave. You're hearing ghosts, you're hearing a chorus of ghosts, essentially. But on the other hand, I think Lynch is also conveying the comfort that people feel in sitcoms, that they come to something familiar. They come to something that is funny quite often, um, and that gives them a feeling of, in a way, a kind of hominess that they watch these at home, they live with these characters, and particularly very long-running sitcoms, people get very emotional when they end. People can be very, sentimental about these characters because they've lived with them for so long. And I think Lynch is trying to convey both of those things by making it kind of absurd. Um, and I do think, as in all of Lynch's work, it's a very grave mistake to see his films as a satire or a criticism of mainstream American culture. He has a deep, deep love for um, American life and American mores and American culture and American people. And that's conveyed even in the films of his that are most sort of dark and disturbing. There might be Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive might be exceptions, but I think all the rest of his films have that sort of sense of, yes, there's goodness here. And you very much see that in Rabbits in that final moment. They're all there for each other in spite of everything. Um, so I think it's one of his greatest works. I really do. It's just a masterpiece, I think.
Yes.
If I can ask you a question, what's your favorite of his films?
Um, uh, my three nominees are currently Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive, and Wild at Heart.
Mm,
Yeah, I remember having the fondest memories seeing them. Of
mhm.
course, these are quite difficult to pick. I like them
Yes.
for different
Mhm.
reasons.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, my personal one is Twin Peaks all the way through, and I thought the third season was extraordinary, just extraordinary. And I Blue Velvet, I have a lot of an attachment to. And, yeah, it's hard to pick just one. There's
Yeah.
something about all of them that are extraordinary.
Mhm.
I keep using that word. I apologize.
Well,
You fall into it with Lynch, you know?
oh yeah, yeah. There are not enough hyperbole to
Mm,
describe his works.
yeah, I agree.
So here's a controversial question. Is Dune his 1984 attempt at adapting the Herbert novel belong in the canon?
I think that even with any genuine artist, and Lynch was one, even the truncated works, the damaged works, have to be included because there is something valuable in them. I always think of Orson Welles' film, The Magnificent Emersons, which was demolished by the studio before its release. And yet there are moments in it that are some of the most transcendent pieces of cinema ever made. And to expel it from Welles's canon would be, I think, a great tragedy. So there are a lot of things in Dune that are Lynch through and through. The costume design, the set design. Um, there is an element of surrealism to it that he can go sort of all the way with that because it's a science fiction film. The kind of aspects of the production, there are aspects of the production the design that are very futuristic, sci-fi. There's aspects that are very retro. Um, so I think there's great value in what remains of Dune, but we do have to take into account that it is, I think, the only one of his films where he did not have final cut, and that the film that we are seeing ultimately is not his. But I wouldn't expel it for any reason. And of course, it's also as a historical document. It's his first collaboration with Kyle MacLachlan, who is essentially his film alter ego, and I think is a very underrated actor. And it's also the only big budget Hollywood movie that he ever made. And for both of those reasons, it's important in order to understand the rest of his career because he never made a big budget movie again deliberately. He told Rafaela de Laurentiis, who was the main producer on that film, he said to her straight up, he said, I'll never make a big film like this again because you can't control it. And that leads into Blue Velvet. That leads into Twin Peaks. That leads into Wild at Heart, definitely. That leads into everything that came after, which for good or ill, he controlled completely. So, yeah, Dune is important in that sense. But it is a damaged film. And I think it's sad that uh, according to Lynch himself, no director's cut exists. He never got to finish it. And I just think it's a shame that, you know, there's no Lynch's version to dig out of the vault and release on streaming or something like that. But yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would say that had not been for the 1984 version, there wouldn't be the Denis Villeneuve two-part masterwork
Hmm.
that we see today.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think, Villeneuve's films, there's some very striking things about them. But I think in a strange way, Lynch's film is more interesting because it has more weirdness in it. It has more It's different. It's not like any other sci-fi blockbuster ever made. There's something really fascinating about it, which is, true of all of Lynch's films, but it's kind of cool to see it in like, it's as if, Salvador Dali had directed Star Wars, It's like it's interesting to see. Whereas Villeneuve's films are more sort of very conventional sci-fi epics. I'm not knocking them. They're great examples of it. But the bizarre nature of Lynch's Dune is kind of fun. It's fun to watch, even though you sort of like, there's a lot of this movie's pretty flawed, but it's a fun movie to watch, I think.
Um, where do you place Lynch in the canon of surrealism, in particular American surrealism?
Well, I mean, that's in some ways the main point of the essay that I wrote, which is that there aren't really any purely American surrealists except for Lynch.
Mhm.
They're all surrealists essentially are working off the European tradition of people like Dali and Max Ernst and painters, usually painters and stuff like that. Lynch, and I actually, the original title of the essay when I submitted it was The Prince of Dark Americana. Um, and I think that I picked it because I did feel that the most fascinating thing about Lynch is that although he was obviously influenced by European surrealism, and I know he was very into Kafka as well, which I think tells you a lot about Eraserhead, but the content that he uses, the archetypes that he employs, the imagery that he employs, the iconography that he employs, is 110% American and mainly 1950s America. James Dean haircuts, Roy Orbison songs, chrome-plated Cadillacs, all of that iconography of the 1950s makes up the sort of undergirding structure of his surrealism. And in that sense, again, I think he's sui generis. He's really quite unique. And I think that it says something, I think, fairly optimistic. His fame and success say something fairly optimistic to me about America, which is that the United States still has the capacity to occasionally produce um, someone who's one of a kind and can make a success of it. We worship that when it's a tech mogul or a great inventor, something like somebody like Steve Jobs or something like that. What's nice about Lynch's success is that we also know that it can be an artist as well who does that. And he can do it in a completely American way. He can do it in a way that is unique to American culture, that uses a purely American aesthetic, while also using some of the techniques from other cultures and other countries. And the United States has always assimilated into itself um, elements from other cultures and other countries. But I think that his Americanness is his uniqueness, and it's what gives his work that again that strange cross between the uncanny and unfamiliar and the familiar and the comfortable that really defines his aesthetic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I think Blue Velvet epitomizes what Lynch views the 1950s, at least in American culture. I think it has been subject, at least in contemporary political discourse or cultural discourse, to either a naive sense of idealism or um, being vilified as a time of massive conformity.
Mm.
I don't think it's that way at all. It's while it is a time of post-war prosperity, it is also a time of great paranoia.
Mhm.
And I think in Blue Velvet, that sense of yeah, was it stability on the surface, but trouble
The dark
below it.
underbelly.
I mean that it's symbolized right in the opening scene, right? When you the camera drives down from the well manicured lawn to this underground where there's like worms and critters and bugs and everything.
Mhm. Yeah, the roiling ants with that rumbling on the soundtrack. Um, yeah, I think Blue Velvet in some ways sums up Lynch's obsessions better than any other of his films, although I don't think it's his greatest film, but I think it in some ways is his purest. It's the most Lynchian, let's say. But I think it really comes down to something Orson Welles once said, which was that there's nothing you can say about America, good or bad, that isn't true. And Lynch, when he was a kid, he was a Boy Scout. And he clearly believed in a lot of the ethos of the Boy Scouts, honesty, integrity, helping people, this sort of stuff. Yet at the same time, and I know this was very important to his maturation, he had lived in one of the worst neighborhoods of Philadelphia and saw a couple of acts of really horrendous violence. I believe he witnessed at least one murder. And so he was painfully aware of both the good and the bad at work in America and how extreme they were. That you could have, on the one hand, this very uh, even naive, idealistic, altruistic set of morals. And on the other hand, you could have this absolutely brutal, unspeakable, random violence without any comprehensible motivation of any kind. And Blue Velvet, in some ways, encapsulates that better than ever, than excuse me, than any of his other films, where you have on the one hand these very pure-hearted um, teenagers played by McLaughlin and Laura Dern, who are trying to save this woman played by Isabella Rossellini, who's being brutally, systematically raped and assaulted by this monster played by Dennis Hopper. And it's Lynch's exploration of that interplay between the light and the dark sides of of American life. And the McLaughlin character is very tempted by the darkness. He's very drawn to it. But he, in the end, opts for good. And he opts for the life of suburban, what critics would say conformity, but what I think Lynch would call serenity. Um, and that, in a lot of ways, sums up for me why Lynch is so important as an American artist, because he understood America and he depicted it very, very honestly in a way that most other filmmakers don't. You either get the beautiful America, Top Gun, you know, America, the stalwart defender of freedom and all the rest of it, or you get this sort of American Beauty, hyper dark, all these horrible, ugly things going on under the surface, and this shiny um, city on a hill is all a lie and a farce, and the American dream is a lie and dead and blah blah blah. Lynch encompasses both of those points of view, and he depicts them in a very honest and I think real manner because you know, they're both true. America does have a very idealistic, very noble, very altruistic side. It also has an incredibly brutal, violent, destructive side. And the interplay between those two has defined American history from the beginning. Not to get off the subject, but all I have to do is look at the Civil War. On the one hand, you have this very noble ideal of ending slavery. And on the other, you have a war that consumes the lives of 600,000 human beings and visits horrendous destruction on the entire country. And the complications of that relationship between high ideals and unspeakable violence defines the debate over the Civil War to this day. So I think Lynch very much is quintessentially American in that. I will also say that in some ways, Lynch's picture of the 1950s is more accurate than the stereotypes of conformity, um, because it nobody ever seems to remember or to mention that the people who, let's say, built the suburban America of the 1950s were pretty much all veterans of one form or another of World War II. So you had millions of people with PTSD. Essentially, you had millions of people who, at the very least, had gone through a horribly traumatic, upending experience in their lives. And a great many of them had seen horrible things. And so it is understandable that they wanted some peace and quiet. And at the same time that they would bring those monsters with them back from war. And so I think in some ways Lynch's vision is is very accurate, more accurate than the stereotypes of the 1950s that you see almost everywhere else, whether it's conservatives who worship it or progressives who hate it. Lynch is Lynch says, no, no, no. There's something even stranger going on here. There's something else, and it's interesting and it's worth exploring.
Mhm. I think the same can be said with Mulholland Drive, his Hollywood film. I should give his other Hollywood film, Inland Empire, another chance. I saw it, but I think I tuned out of it in the first hour. Uh,
It's
I
long.
yeah, I couldn't quite get into it, but yeah, I'll give it a chance someday. But there is a view amongst like filmmakers when depicting Hollywood. They either revel in its excess, in the same way as that Babylon movie, I believe,
Mhm.
uh, or they look at it with harsh criticism in the sense of, I don't know, the player.
Mm.
Lynch has a very unique view in that he believes it as it's a beautiful dream,
Yeah.
which can also contain nightmarish experiences. But at the same time, you have to wake up from that dream, and that's where I think the first and the second half of Mulholland Drive sort of separates. So I'd like to hear
Mm.
your thoughts on it.
Well, I think Mulholland Drive, well, I think Lost Highway is his darkest film.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I don't much care for it. I admire its technical brilliance, but I just don't want to be in that place.
Mhm.
Mulholland Drive is only slightly less dark, I think.
Yeah.
Mulholland Drive strikes me as one of his darkest films. But I think you have a point because it's also his most beautiful. It's his most classically beautiful film. It's the one that most obviously deliberately evokes the look of classic Golden Age Hollywood films. The cinematography is gorgeous. The the way that he films Naomi Watts and I can't remember the name of the other female lead. I'm ashamed of myself. But at any rate, the way that he films them in such a classical movie star kind of way is just mesmerizing. And you're right. In the second half, he then proceeds to tear that to shreds. And even Naomi Watts becomes, in a way, uglier. She becomes paler and more haggard looking. And um, it's his and I think, like you said, he's saying yes. There's all these beautiful dreams in Hollywood, but a lot of them get broken. And that's present in Inland Empire as well towards the end. Um, and you should I recommend giving Inland Empire another shot. It's kind of Lynch Unbound. I think he was so enraptured with discovering digital cinematography
Mhm.
that he just kind of said, "Okay, I'm going to take everything I'm currently obsessed with and just shove it all into one film and do it really cheap." But yeah, Mulholland Drive is it's interesting to see that it's both one of his and maybe his most beautiful. And maybe that's what he wanted to say about Hollywood because he did live in LA and he did, to some degree participate in the Hollywood system. And there was clearly something he loved about Hollywood because he's always evoking the aesthetic of the golden age of Hollywood. Um, so maybe he was trying to do with Hollywood what he did with Suburbia to say, yes, there's these beautiful things about it and these horrific things about it. Although he does seem in the end in Mulholland Drive, he does seem to condemn Hollywood in a way that he doesn't condemn suburbia. My impression is that ultimately the view taken of Hollywood in Mulholland Drive is pretty negative. I think it's he's basically saying, yeah, there's this beautiful side to it, but really it's suicide. If you come to this town, you're just gonna get completely crushed. Although there's moments of absolutely transcendent beauty in that film. I mean, the scene where the two leads are in the theater and there's a singer singing an a cappella, I think it's a cappella, Spanish version of the Roy Orbison song Crying. And it's just the woman singing and them watching. It's just an absolutely transcendent moment of cinema. It's all done in the faces. It's all everything that Lynch is trying to convey is done just through faces and sort of slowly cutting back and forth. And yeah, it's a beautiful film to watch in many ways, but it's hard to take for me in the end. It's hard for me to sort of process its message, I guess. You know, maybe I'm cheesy. I like the ones with happy endings more than
Oh yeah. So as an aside, I certainly believe that the reason why I think mainstream Hollywood movies have been less than interesting these days is because those who are working in that system, they seem to have forgotten why we, the non-Hollywood people, go to watch movies to begin with. Um, I think an exception, I suppose, would be, for as much of his like ham-fisted anti-Americanism, the brutalists. I think that it for much of it's like obvious soapboxing about the state
Mhm.
of America. It is one of those movies that makes me it confirms my reasons why I go to movies in the first place, to watch
Mm.
a story well told. Um, do you get the sense in watching David Lynch movies that he sees that, cinema is the American pastime, that people will go to see movies, especially his movies, for the same
Yes.
reason as you and I do?
Yes, and I agree with you on the poverty of Hollywood today. I think to a great extent they've just forgotten how to make films. The Marvel template has just taken over everything. Make more and more comic book films, shove as much CGI into it as you can, write a script as if it was written by AI, and pretty soon I think they will be written by AI. Basically, we have a string of set pieces, just somehow stitch them together with the barest excuse. So yeah, Christopher Nolan has made some quite good films. I thought Dunkirk was a genuinely great film. I liked about two-thirds of Oppenheimer. I haven't seen The Brutalist, but I have heard that it's quite good. And but on the whole, yeah, I think Lynch more even. I would say there's two directors who you can just look at them and say, okay, these guys loved movies, just loved cinema for cinema. And that's Francois Truffaut and Martin Scorsese. Just from the way they talk about it, you can tell they're like little kids when they talk about movies. I think Lynch is pretty close to that. I think Lynch was one of those directors who was just absolutely in love with his medium. And you can tell by the care he takes. Again, Eraserhead. The reason Eraserhead took so long to make was not just money, it was that Lynch was so exacting about every single shot. He said that some nights, some days we would shoot for 18 hours and get one shot. And that's just because he was so exacting about where he was putting the lights and all the technical aspects, what kind of lens he was using and all that. So I think that he loved the craft. He loved the act of making movies, and he loved I think he loved watching movies too. Um, so yeah, but this is important too. I think he knew, and this is speculation on my part, but I think he knew that the movies are America's greatest cultural achievement. And that's why I find the current state of Hollywood so sad. Because for many, many decades, American cinema was hands down the greatest cinema in the world. I would say from the end of the silent era until the end of the new Hollywood era, essentially until Star Wars comes out. American cinema stands above all other cinema, which is not to put down or degrade French or Japanese or Soviet cinema. There was wonderful, wonderful films coming out of them. But the United States, it was cinema at its pinnacle. That's not true anymore, at all. And I think the best films today are actually coming out of Asia, China, Hong Kong, um, Japan, Korea. That's where real cinema is being made today, I think. At any rate, I think though that Lynch really believed in the value of cinema as the greatest cultural product of American civilization. And I think that was why he so embraced Americana in his films. He was saying this is in every, it's not just that I don't think he was consciously ignoring the European tradition of surrealism. I think he was saying that all of this Americana, all of this American iconography is in every way the equal of the European tradition. And the reason it's the equal is because of the movies, because American movies are better than European movies. Um, and I don't know. He, I could be wrong, but I don't think he ever said very much about the current state of Hollywood, unlike, say, Martin Scorsese, who's been very vocal about the fact that the state of American cinema is basically terrible. But I wouldn't be surprised if he felt maybe that something was off. Although he may not have. He may have just thought, well, I'm going to keep doing what I do, and Hollywood does what it does. I'm happy to take its money. If I can't, I'll make movies with an iPhone. That may have been how he saw it. I don't know. But yes, I think that he really respected film as America's greatest cultural achievement.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I believe Inland Empire was his final film, feature film, and it
Mhm.
was released in 2006. His final release overall is the Twin Peaks: The Return, so 2017, I believe. Do you think that, at the time of his passing, there is maybe one more movie or show left in him?
Well, apparently he was very close to a deal with Netflix to make a series for them, which obviously didn't happen because he got ill, or at least he got so ill that he couldn't physically do it anymore. Um, the answer, I think, is unequivocally yes. I'll bet he had another one in him. He never made Ronnie Rocket, which was his great dream project since Eraserhead. That was the film he wanted to make after he made Eraserhead. It was the film he wanted to make after he'd made Dune, and it just could never get the money together because I guess the script was so weird that no one wanted to back it. So he still had magnificent obsessions that he hadn't realized yet. I do think that by the last few years of his life, it does seem that he was just no longer physically able to direct a film, which is terribly sad. But you know, there's nothing to be done about that. But had he been able to find some way, maybe directing via Zoom, something like that, John Huston directed his last film from a wheelchair with an oxygen tank. So it's not impossible. He could have done it. But I have no doubt that there were things working away in that brain of his that we would have gotten another. He probably would have done that series for Netflix. We'd probably have gotten another film out of him, at least another couple of short films. But obviously, we'll never know. It's like with Stanley Kubrick. There definitely would have been another film or two coming out of Stanley Kubrick, and we'll never see them.
Yeah. I saw John Huston's last film. That was his adaptation of Joyce's The Dead, right? I think. Yeah, when I read that short story, I never thought that it could be adapted in a movie. But when I saw it, it stayed true to to the original source brilliantly.
Mm. Yeah, Houston. I mean, we could actually. That's an interesting view with Lynch, which is that although he died relatively young by our standards, Houston didn't live much longer, I think, than age 70. I could be wrong about that. But um, it's very rare in cinema to have late works because both physically it becomes difficult to do as you get older, and people stop giving you the money because they want to bring the kids into the theater. And if you're over the age of 60, maybe over the age of 55, they just don't think you can do it anymore. You're old, you're out of touch. That's it. You're done. So it's rare to get late works in cinema. And with Lynch, we do have some short films that were made fairly late in his life, and we have Twin Peaks: The Return. And so it's interesting to look at Lynch as a mature or even an aging artist as something that we don't normally get. And it would be nice if we had more of it as he had gone on in life. But he did have something that Houston had, and this is what made me think of it. Houston, when he was, I think in the late 1970s, he made a picture called Wise Blood with Brad Dourif. That was about a deranged young preacher in the South. And it is easily one of the most disturbing movies I've ever seen. But my main thought when I watched it was this is not the film of an old man. I don't care if he was in his late 60s, early 70s when he directed this movie. This is the film of a daring, young filmmaker who's taking chances. And I think if you watch Twin Peaks: The Return, you get the same thing. This is not, and it is in a way a 13-hour film. This is not a movie made by a young man. This guy is, the fact that Agent Cooper doesn't even appear until the second to last episode of a Twin Peaks revival, whether you like that or not, and I still go back and forth on whether I that was a mistake or whether I think that was a mistake or not, but it's gutsy as hell. He's taking a lot of chances on that show. And I think that that really is a testimony to his talent, that he remained so vital and so courageous, so fearless in what he was doing at such an advanced age, or at least, speaking of filmmakers as a relatively advanced age to still be making films. I think is a really really interesting way to look at his later pictures, and it's valuable because we have so few. We have Kurosawa's later films. Scorsese now has been The Irishman to me is very much the film of an old man. There's a few others, but for the most part, it's rare. It's rare to get those, and it's valuable, I think. But yeah, he would have had more. He would have made more. It's too bad that he won't.
Yeah, I should check out that Houston movie. I'm a big fan of Flannery O'Connor. So
Mm. It's quite extraordinary, but it's really dark. It's one of it's like it's almost like Taxi Driver, but without the violence. It's
mhm.
just, but it has that sense of just this, you're going along with this deeply, deeply disturbed protagonist, and it weighs on you after a while. It's kind of like Lost Highway in that sense,
Yeah.
because my reaction to Lost Highway was just, I don't want to be in this space. I don't want to be wherever he is when he wrote this movie and directed this movie. It's not a place I want to be. This is unpleasant. Uh, so, but some people love it. Uh, some people adore that movie. I think just because of Robert Blake's performance.
Oh yeah.
The eyebrowless devil. He is quite striking. He's wonderful too. I mean, the last person you'd expect, Banachek or whatever he played on TV, this TV detective and a child actor from the Little Rascals, giving this incredibly menacing, dark, powerful performance in a David Lynch movie. The last thing you would expect. He's wonderful. He's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
That's something actually, that's worth pointing out. Lynch was really good at directing actors, which people don't give him credit for usually. But the performances in his movies are almost uniformly wonderful. Um, he's not a realist in terms of the way he uses acting, but there's just fantastic, fantastic performances right from Eraserhead. I think Jack Nance is incredible in Eraserhead. And McLaughlin gives in Twin Peaks: The Return, McLaughlin basically plays three different characters, all of them brilliantly. He was a real actor's director when he wanted to be, I think.
I'd like to end on this note. You said in the essay that Lynch is a very spiritual filmmaker. So
Mm.
do elaborate on how this spirituality manifests itself in his cinematic works.
Well, I mean, it's obvious that his primary form of spirituality was um, transcendental meditation. In other words, had a kind of new agey sort of form of spirituality. But I do think that there is in his films, there's a very strong streak of the supernatural, particularly in Twin Peaks, with its idea of the Red Room, the Black Lodge, this kind of other world that Agent Cooper is trapped in between the second season and the third season, and that he escapes in this very strange, surreal way. And of course, in The Return, you have one of the greatest episodes of television ever made, where you get the origin story of Twin Peaks, in which the evil that is Killer Bob is apparently set off by the Los Alamos nuclear test. And Laura Palmer is sent down as this kind of angelic being to counter him. So he definitely had a kind of spirituality in that I think that he felt there was. I think he felt that good and evil absolutely existed in a metaphysical sense, and that they are in contention in the world. How that played into his practice, belief in transcendental meditation, I don't know. I don't know enough about transcendental meditation. I don't know enough about his relationship with it. But I think spiritually speaking, in an odd way, I mean, he's very much a Christian, a Protestant from the Midwest, which is what he was. He believed, I think, in human compassion. He believed in human goodness. He believed in honesty, uprightness, treating people fairly. But again, it's that thing of being very, very painfully aware also of the fact that there is a kind of that evil is also very real, and that people quite often do not practice these good things. They do terrible things. Sometimes because they're sadists, sometimes because they can't help it, sometimes because they're weak, but they do these things, and we have to, the forces of good have to contend with them. And I think he believed that part of that, again, in a very Christian way, was love. I think if you watch particularly the first season of Twin Peaks, that show is all about people who insist upon loving each other in spite of everything. Um, the relationships between the characters are sometimes dark, but a lot of them are very, very tender and very caring and very altruistic. And there's a real sense that a lot of the people in this community are decent. And I think Agent Cooper gives a speech about that actually to his sort of very cynical colleague who's kind of denouncing the town as a bunch of hicks. And Agent Cooper says, you know, I thought that, you know, integrity and honor and loyalty were dead, but they're alive and well here in Twin Peaks. I think that's Lynch talking as much as, you know, there may be in Frank in Blue Velvet, there may be some of Lynch in there, Lynch's dark side, his darker fantasies maybe in Frank, but there's a lot of Lynch in what Agent Cooper says in that scene. There's a lot of Lynch in the birds that are singing at the end of Blue Velvet. He really believes in these things. So in that sense, I think he is his spirituality is a kind of a mix between, I suppose, his New Age practices and a very basic Midwestern American understanding of Christian values, Protestant Christian values.
Right. I think that wraps up our conversation about David Lynch. I wish it was longer, but
Mm.
yeah, I'm very much mindful of your time. Thank you
I
very
had
much.
a I
Thank
had a terrific
you.
time. Thank you very much.
All right.
Best.